"Please take it off." The rancher froze, then broke the ritual Wild West stories. The winter air was sharp, biting at his face and hands as he pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders. The ranch was quiet, as it always was in the early hours, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. He had lived here for almost all of his 42 years, carving a life out of the unforgiving land, tending to his cattle, mending fences, and making sure the ranch ran like clockwork. The townsfolk often whispered about him. Some said he was cold, others said he was wise, but everyone agreed that Jake was a man who did not waste words. His life was simple, guided by routines that brought comfort and control in a world that could be wild and cruel. Jake moved through his morning chores with the practiced ease of a man who had done them 1,000 times before. He filled the water troughs, checked the fences for damage from the snow, and fed the few remaining calves that had been born that winter. His hands were rough and calloused, his fingers stiff from the cold, yet each movement was precise, almost graceful. He worked silently, the only sounds being the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant howl of a lone coyote. Despite the harshness of the land, Jake felt at home here. The ranch was more than his livelihood. It was his sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos seemed to pause at the edge of the hills. As he worked, Jake's mind wandered to the stories his father had told him when he was a boy. Tales of daring cowboys, of cattle drives that spanned hundreds of miles, of storms that could tear apart a herd if a man wasn't careful. His father had also spoken of rituals, old traditions meant to protect the ranchers and their cattle from misfortune. Jake had always been skeptical of such things, believing that hard work, careful planning, and common sense were far more reliable than any superstition. Yet there was a part of him, a quiet curiosity, that wondered if perhaps there was something more, some secret in the traditions that could not be seen with the eyes alone. It was then that the sound of hooves broke the silence. Jake looked up, squinting against the pale morning sun, and saw a stranger approaching. The man rode a black horse that looked strong and well cared for, his coat dusted with snow, his hat pulled low over his face. There was an air about him, something that made Jake instinctively tense, though he could not have said why. The stranger slowed as he reached the edge of the ranch, tipping his hat politely before speaking. "Morning, Mr. Hollister," the man said in a calm, steady voice. "Name S. Silas. I've been traveling through these parts, and I hear you might be the man to help me with something." Jake raised an eyebrow, leaning on the fence post. He didn't often get visitors, and when he did, it was usually someone asking for work, or perhaps a passing traveler seeking shelter. But there was something about Silas that felt different, almost important, though Jake didn't know why. "What brings you here?" Jake asked, his voice low and cautious. Silas dismounted smoothly, letting his horse wander to the side while he adjusted the straps of his saddle. "I come with a message and perhaps an opportunity," he said, his eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "There's a ritual happening tonight, on the frozen river not far from here. It's an old custom meant to protect the herds during the winter drive. Most of the townsfolk participate, but they say the one who leads the herd must take part in a very special way. I thought you might want to see it for yourself." Jake frowned, shaking his head slightly. "A ritual? I don't deal with that kind of thing. I've managed cattle and land for decades, Silas. I've never needed a ritual to keep things safe." Silas smiled faintly as if he expected the response. "I understand. But sometimes, Mr. Hollister, it's not about need. It's about respect, tradition, and courage. And this isn't just any ritual, it's said to be something remarkable for the man who dares to participate fully." Jake studied Silas for a long moment. The man's words were strange, almost poetic, and yet there was a sincerity in his tone that Jake could not ignore. He felt a twinge of curiosity, something he had not felt in years. Could there be truth in the old ways? Could something happen tonight that might change his view of the world, even if just a little? Still, Jake was cautious. "I'll watch," he said finally, his voice firm. "But I make no promises about taking part. I have work to do, cattle to check, and snow to clear." Silas nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's all anyone can ask. Just being there will be enough to understand what I mean." With that, Silas mounted his horse and rode ahead toward the town, leaving Jake to his thoughts. The rancher continued his morning chores, but his mind was no longer fully on the work. He found himself imagining the frozen river, the gathered townspeople, and the strange ritual that awaited. A part of him resisted, telling him that superstition had no place in his life. But another part, quieter yet insistent, felt a flicker of excitement, a sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt since he was a boy listening to his father's stories by the fireplace. By midday, the sky had turned a pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised more snow by evening. Jake paused by the barn, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. He looked at his reflection in the frosted window and saw a man both hardened by life and yet open to possibilities he rarely allowed himself to consider. He wondered if he had grown too cautious, too rigid in his ways, and whether tonight might offer a chance to step outside the walls he had built around himself. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ranch, Jake began to prepare for the day's end chores with an unusual sense of alertness. He tended to the cattle, ensuring each one was fed and sheltered as the wind grew sharper. Every sound seemed magnified, the creaking of the barn doors, the distant cry of a crow, the crunch of snow under his boots. Each step brought him closer to the inevitable encounter at the frozen river, and despite his calm exterior, his heart beat a little faster. By late afternoon, Jake finished his work and leaned against the fence, gazing at the horizon. The wind carried with it the faint sound of distant voices, perhaps from the town preparing for the evening's ritual. He felt a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He didn't know what he would find there, or whether he would be asked to do something beyond his comfort. But he knew one thing. When the time came, he would face it with the same determination he had brought to every challenge on the ranch, steady, careful, and unwavering. As the first stars began to appear in the cold winter sky, Jake finally made his decision. He would go to the river. Not out of faith in the ritual, nor out of superstition, but because he wanted to understand, to see with his own eyes what the townspeople believed so strongly in. He saddled his horse, checked the reins, and set out across the snowy landscape, each hoofbeat carrying him closer to a night that would test his courage, his patience, and perhaps even the very essence of his beliefs. By the time he reached the edge of the frozen river, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving behind a world of muted colors and long shadows. The townspeople were gathering, their voices low and serious, and the air buzzed with a strange energy. Jake dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the snow, and took a deep breath. Whatever was about to happen, he reminded himself, he would face it with his head held high. After all, courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. And so Jake Hollister, the quiet rancher who had lived his life by routines and work, stepped toward the unknown, unaware that this night would change the way the town, and he himself, would remember him forever. Jake's boots crunched softly against the icy ground as he approached. The frozen river. The pale light of the winter evening cast long shadows across the snow, making the world seem both beautiful and eerie. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and something he could not quite identify, an undercurrent of anticipation that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He had never seen the townspeople gather like this before, so many of them standing together in silence, their breath forming little clouds that drifted upward and disappeared into the cold sky. At the center of the clearing, a circle of candles flickered weakly against the wind. Their light danced across the frozen river, reflecting in the ice and creating a sparkling, almost magical effect. The townsfolk, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes fixed on the center of the circle. A few of them carried small bundles of herbs or items that Jake didn't recognize, while others simply stood, arms crossed, watching with quiet intensity. Jake paused at the edge of the gathering, unsure whether he should step closer. He felt the eyes of the townspeople on him instantly. Even from a distance, he could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and expectant. They were waiting for him. The thought made his chest tighten. He had come to observe, he reminded himself, not to participate. Yet there was no ignoring the sense that he had been chosen for something beyond his understanding. Silas, the traveler who had first mentioned the ritual, was already in the circle, his black coat blending with the dim shadows. He looked at Jake and nodded, a subtle gesture that said both encouragement and warning. Jake swallowed hard, feeling a cold shiver run through him. There was a solemnity here that he could not deny, an energy that seemed to hum in the icy air. Slowly Jake stepped closer, his boots leaving shallow prints in the snow. The closer he got, the more details he noticed. The ritual was precise. Candles were arranged in a perfect circle, with a single larger candle at the center. The townspeople moved carefully, almost like a dance, their movements deliberate and synchronized. There was an order to it, a pattern that spoke of tradition and care. Jake realized that this was not merely superstition. This was a practice that had been repeated for generations, refined and preserved. The townspeople began to chant softly, their voices blending into a low, steady rhythm. Jake could not understand the words, but the sound was powerful, calming and commanding at the same time. It seemed to ripple through the air, filling the clearing with a strange, electric presence. The wind swirled around them, tugging at coats and hats, but the circle remained untouched by the gusts, almost as if it existed in its own little world. Then came the part that made Jake's heart skip a beat. One by one, the participants began to remove certain articles of clothing, not in a show of frivolity, but as a symbolic gesture. Coats, scarves, and gloves were taken off and placed carefully on the ground beside them. Jake noticed that each person's movements were calm, deliberate, almost reverent. This was a ritual of humility, of trust, and perhaps of courage, he realized. The thought made his stomach twist. Suddenly, all eyes turned to him. The entire circle seemed to shift slightly, as if drawing attention toward his presence. Jake froze, his boots gripping the icy ground. He had expected to observe from the edge, to remain a spectator, but it became clear that the ritual demanded his participation. He was the rancher, the man who would lead the winter cattle drive, and thus he was now at the center of their attention. Jake's mind raced. Remove his coat, his gloves, even step closer to the center. The thought was absurd. The wind was biting cold, the ice beneath his feet slick and treacherous. He could see the snow settling on the townspeople's heads and shoulders, and the sheer exposure would be unbearable. Yet, as he looked into the calm, expectant faces around him, he realized that stepping back would not be an option. To refuse would not only embarrass him, but might also insult the tradition the town had held sacred for decades. Silas came forward, his dark eyes steady on Jake. "It's your turn," he said softly. "The ritual is not about humiliation. It's about courage, about acknowledging the responsibility you carry. You don't have to understand it fully, but you must participate." Jake nodded slowly, though his hands shook slightly. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, but there was a strange, compelling energy in the air, one that made hesitation almost impossible. He remembered his father's words from long ago. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite the fear. Now those words felt alive, pulsing in his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the center of the circle. Every eye followed him. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and he could feel the cold biting through his thick pants. He reached the spot where the candles flickered brightest and stopped, trying to steady his racing heart. His hands shook as he unclasped his coat, hesitating for just a moment as the wind whipped across his shoulders. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he removed his coat and folded it neatly on the snow beside him. The wind hit him full force, cold enough to make him shiver uncontrollably, but he remained upright. The townspeople murmured quietly, not in mockery but in approval, as if acknowledging the courage it took for a man like him to face something so uncomfortable and strange. Next came his gloves. He removed them slowly, exposing his bare hands to the freezing air. Pain shot through his fingers, but he clenched his fists and tried to ignore it. The chant continued, steady and unwavering, surrounding him with a sense of rhythm and purpose. Jake could feel a strange warmth, not from the cold but from the realization that he was part of something larger than himself. Silas stepped closer, guiding him with quiet words. "It's not about the cold," he said. "It's about the act. Feel it, understand it, and let it remind you of the responsibility you carry." Jake nodded again, swallowing hard. He could feel his body trembling, not just from the chill, but from the intensity of the moment. He realized that the ritual was testing more than just physical endurance. It was testing resolve, humility, and the ability to act even when the situation seemed impossible. Around him, the townspeople continued their movements, their faces calm and focused. Jake noticed the care with which they handled the ritual items, the way they treated each gesture as sacred. This was a ceremony born not out of fear, but out of respect for the land, for the cattle, for the generations who had come before. He began to understand why it mattered, even if he didn't fully grasp the old words and chants. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with expectation. Jake's teeth chattered and the cold bit deeper, but he refused to back down. His father's words echoed louder now, and he remembered all the winters he had endured alone on the ranch, all the times he had faced storms, illness, and uncertainty. Courage, he realized, was not just for facing wild animals or harsh weather. It was for moments like this, when the world watched and something inside demanded action. Finally, the moment came when Jake was expected to complete the final gesture of the ritual. He froze, the wind whipping around him, the candles flickering like tiny stars in the snow. He could hear the faint rustle of coats and the soft crunch of boots from the townspeople, all waiting for him to act. The sense of responsibility was immense, almost suffocating, but Jake knew what he had to do. He lifted his head, took another deep breath, and prepared to face whatever the ritual demanded of him. For the first time, he understood the strange, unspoken power of the tradition. It was not the cold, the exposure, or even the chanting that made it important. It was the courage to step forward, to act with integrity, and to face the moment fully, despite fear, doubt, and discomfort. Jake's mind cleared as he focused on the task at hand. The cold no longer mattered as much as the significance of what he was doing. He could feel the weight of generations pressing on him, the silent approval of the townsfolk, and the quiet guidance of Silas. In that moment, he realized that rituals like this were not about superstition. They were about community, respect, and the enduring human spirit. As the evening deepened and the shadows grew longer across the frozen river, Jake stood at the center of the circle, fully aware of the eyes upon him, fully aware of the meaning of his actions. He had stepped into the ritual not as a skeptic, not as a spectator, but as a participant, willing to embrace the unknown and the uncomfortable. And in doing so, he discovered something profound, not just about the ritual, but about himself. Jake stood at the center of the circle, his breath forming white clouds in the cold winter air. The icy wind whipped across his bare shoulders, and the snow crunched under his boots as he shifted his weight to stay steady. For a moment, he felt frozen, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of expectation pressing down on him. Every pair of eyes in the circle was on him, watching, waiting. He could hear the faint murmurs of the townspeople, the soft rustle of clothing, and the distant call of a crow in the frostbitten trees. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second into an eternity. Jake's mind raced. He could feel the sting of the cold on his skin, his hands numb, his teeth chattering. He had faced many challenges in his life, harsh winters, stampeding cattle, injuries, and isolation, but nothing had ever felt like this. The ritual was not dangerous in a physical sense, yet the pressure to act, to perform, to honor the tradition was almost unbearable. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly human. For the first time in years, he was not in control. He remembered his father's words again, spoken by the fireside many winters ago. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Jake. Courage is acting even when your legs shake, even when your heart races. It's doing what's right, not what's easy. The memory brought a strange warmth, cutting through the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. His father had faced hardships too, he realized, and his life had been full of moments like this, moments where fear could be paralyzing, yet action was necessary. Silas stepped closer, his presence calm and steady. "It's all right, Jake," he said quietly. "The ritual isn't about showing off. It's about accepting responsibility. You've come this far, just take one step at a time." Jake nodded, but his body refused to move at first. He felt the weight of everyone's expectations, the centuries of tradition behind the ritual, and the strange sense that the entire town depended on him in this moment. It was more than a test of courage. It was a test of character, of patience, of integrity. He clenched his fists to keep them from shaking too violently, but it did little to stop the cold from biting into his fingers. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and looked around at the townspeople. He saw faces filled with quiet anticipation, not mockery or judgment. They were not trying to shame him. They were waiting to see if he could rise to the occasion, to respect what they had carried for generations. Jake realized that the ritual was not merely about the act of removing clothing or standing in the cold. It was about trust, humility, and leadership. The townspeople trusted him to lead their winter cattle drive safely, and now, in this small but symbolic moment, he was being asked to prove that trust. Time seemed to slow even further. Every heartbeat thundered in his ears. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and he could feel his muscles tense with the cold. Sweat mixed with snow melting on his skin, making him shiver even more. For a fleeting moment, he considered stepping back, leaving the ritual unfinished and retreating to the safety of his cabin. It would have been easy, comfortable, and sensible. But then he remembered all the winters he had endured alone, all the hardships he had faced without complaint. Retreating now would not just betray the ritual, it would betray himself. Slowly, Jake began to move. One foot in front of the other, he stepped closer to the center of the circle. Each movement felt deliberate, measured, as if the snow beneath him had a rhythm that demanded respect. He could feel the cold biting through his pants and boots, but he refused to focus on the discomfort. He focused instead on the purpose, on the meaning behind every gesture. He thought about the cattle he would lead through snow and ice, about the generations who had come before him, and about the life he had built on this land. All of it demanded courage, demanded action. When he reached the center, he paused, letting the moment settle. The wind howled around him, tugging at his hair and coat, but he remained upright, steadying himself against the invisible pressure of the crowd. His hands shook as he unclasped his coat and folded it neatly on the snow beside him. The cold hit him full force, and he shivered violently, but he held his ground. The townspeople whispered softly, their voices almost blending with the chant that continued to echo through the clearing. He could feel their approval, a silent recognition of his bravery. Then came the gloves. Jake hesitated for a moment, staring at them as if they were objects far more daunting than they truly were. Removing them meant exposing his hands to the freezing air, feeling pain and numbness that would linger for hours. Yet he remembered the lesson his father had taught him so many years ago. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act despite it. He took a deep breath and pulled off his gloves, letting his bare hands meet the icy wind. The sting was sharp and immediate, but it was accompanied by an odd sense of clarity. As he stood there, fully exposed to the elements, Jake felt something shift within him. The ritual, which had seemed strange and intimidating at first, now felt purposeful and alive. It was not about humiliation or spectacle. It was about understanding, respect, and leadership. Every glance from the townspeople, every soft chant, every flicker of candlelight reminded him of the responsibility he carried, not just for the cattle, but for the community that depended on him. Silas approached again, placing a hand lightly on Jake's shoulder. "Good," he said. "You're doing exactly what's needed. Now stay present, feel it, learn from it." Jake nodded, letting the words settle into his mind. He could feel his heart pounding, his muscles tense, and the cold biting at every exposed inch of skin. But beneath it all was a steady rhythm, a sense of purpose that grounded him in a way he had not felt in years. He realized that the ritual was teaching him something profound. Leadership was not about dominance or fear. It was about humility, courage, and the ability to face discomfort for a greater good. The townspeople began to move in unison again, a fluid motion that seemed almost choreographed. They adjusted the candles, rearranged the ritual items, and continued their chants. Jake watched, absorbing every detail, every movement, every subtle gesture. He noticed how carefully they treated each element, how much reverence they showed for tradition, and how deeply their actions were rooted in respect. He began to understand that rituals like this were not meant to be understood immediately. They were meant to be experienced, felt, and honored. As the evening deepened, Jake felt the cold less sharply, replaced by a burning awareness of the moment's significance. His body trembled not only from the temperature, but from the intensity of what he was experiencing. He realized that he had stepped into something far bigger than himself, a story that had been passed down for generations, a moment that connected him to those who had come before and those who would follow. He closed his eyes briefly, taking another deep breath, and centered himself. Fear and doubt still lingered, but they no longer controlled him. He had made a choice, to act with courage, to honor the ritual, and to face whatever came next with integrity. In that moment, he felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and strength, of uncertainty and clarity. The wind swirled around him, the candles flickered like tiny stars in the snow, and the townspeople watched silently, their presence steady and reassuring. Jake realized that he was no longer just a participant in the ritual. He was part of a living tradition, a moment of human connection, courage, and respect that transcended the cold and the fear. Finally, Jake opened his eyes fully and looked around the circle. He saw nods of approval, quiet smiles, and eyes that reflected understanding and trust. He had faced the moment, embraced the discomfort, and acted with courage. For the first time that evening, he felt a deep sense of belonging, not just to the town, but to something larger than himself, something enduring. And in that realization, Jake knew he was ready for what came next. Whatever the ritual demanded, whatever challenges awaited in the winter night, he would face them with a steady heart and unwavering resolve. The wind howled across the frozen river as Jake stood in the center of the circle, his coat and gloves long discarded, his bare hands and shoulders stinging from the icy cold. Despite the chill, he felt a strange warmth rising from inside, a mixture of pride, relief, and an unexpected connection to the townspeople who had gathered. He had faced the moment of fear and hesitation, had acted with courage, and now he felt as if the ritual itself had shifted. It was no longer something alien or strange. It was something alive, something he was now a part of. The townspeople began to stir, moving in deliberate, synchronized motions. They carried small bundles of herbs, feathers, and other objects, placing them carefully on the ice around the central candle. Jake watched, fascinated as they treated each item with reverence, almost as if these objects were alive and sacred. The chants grew louder, their rhythm stronger, and the energy in the circle intensified. Jake could feel it vibrating through his body, mingling with the cold, making his shivers feel almost purposeful. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to relax, to take in the scene fully. He looked at the faces around him and noticed something he hadn't before: the pride, the respect, and the quiet admiration. He realized that the ritual was not meant to humiliate or punish anyone. It was a celebration of courage and trust, a communal acknowledgement that life, especially in these harsh winters, required bravery, resilience, and cooperation. By standing in the cold, by following through despite his fear, he had earned the town's respect in a way that words alone could not convey. Silas moved closer again, his dark eyes studying Jake. "You're doing well," he said quietly, as if speaking above the wind would break the spell of the moment. "But the final part comes soon. It may not be what you expect. Remember, courage isn't just about enduring discomfort. Sometimes it's about action, about taking initiative, about shaping the moment rather than just surviving it." Jake's pulse quickened. He had endured the cold, followed the ritual, and faced the scrutiny of the entire town. What could come next? He scanned the circle and noticed that the central candle was beginning to flicker more violently, as if warning of something unusual. The wind swirled around it, tugging at the flames, making shadows dance across the snow. Then, almost without warning, a sudden gust of wind swept through the circle, scattering the ritual items across the frozen river. Herbs flew through the air, feathers tumbled and spun, and the careful arrangement of candles shifted haphazardly. Gasps rose from the townspeople, and some hurried forward to gather the scattered items. The chant faltered for a moment, replaced by murmurs of surprise and concern. Jake felt his heart leap in his chest. The ritual was breaking apart, yet the town did not panic. Instead, they looked toward him, silently waiting for him to act. It was as if the responsibility he had carried so far had shifted into a new, unexpected challenge. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward. The cold had numbed his mind slightly, sharpening his instincts. He began gathering the scattered items, picking up the herbs and feathers, arranging the candles once more. His movements were careful and deliberate, guided by a mixture of intuition and respect for the tradition. The townspeople followed his lead, quietly assisting, but it was clear that the initiative had passed to him. For the first time, Jake realized that the ritual was not rigid. It was flexible, alive, and responsive to those who were brave enough to step up. As he worked, he felt a strange sense of exhilaration. The fear and discomfort that had dominated his earlier moments melted into purpose. Each item he placed, each candle he adjusted, was a statement of leadership, humility, and courage. He understood now that the ritual's meaning extended beyond endurance. It was about taking responsibility, about acting decisively when the moment demanded it, and about inspiring others through example. The townspeople began to chant again, this time more steadily, their voices rising in unison as if to support Jake. He moved with them, synchronizing his actions with theirs, and a strange harmony filled the clearing. The wind no longer felt hostile. It felt like part of the ritual, a test that had transformed into an opportunity. With each motion, Jake felt stronger, more connected, more alive. He was no longer just a participant, he was a leader, shaping the outcome of the ceremony in real time. Silas observed silently, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "This is the moment," he murmured, "not just of courage but of choice. You can follow the ritual or you can guide it. Either way, your integrity will shine." Jake realized the truth in those words. The ritual had presented him with a challenge, but it had also given him an opportunity. By acting decisively, by taking responsibility for the scattered items and guiding the townspeople. He had transformed the ritual from a rigid ceremony into a living, breathing moment of communal strength. He could feel the respect and trust of the people around him, not just for his courage, but for his ability to act thoughtfully and decisively in the face of the unexpected. As the evening deepened, the wind began to die down, and the snow settled into soft drifts across the frozen river. The candles, now carefully rearranged, flickered steadily, casting a warm glow across the circle. The chant continued, but it had transformed into a celebration rather than a test. Jake stood at the center, his bare hands still cold, his shoulders stinging, but his heart was full. He had faced fear, endured discomfort, and acted with courage and initiative. The townspeople began to nod and smile, quietly acknowledging his actions. Some whispered words of approval, while others simply looked at him with silent admiration. Jake felt a sense of connection he had rarely experienced in his life. This moment, this ritual, had brought him closer to the people of the town, closer to the generations of ranchers who had come before, and closer to a deeper understanding of what courage truly meant. Silas stepped forward once more. "Well done," he said. "You have not only endured, but you have led. That is the true meaning of the ritual." Jake felt a wave of relief and pride. The moment of fear, hesitation, and cold had passed, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and understanding. He realized that rituals like this were not about blind obedience or superstition. They were about community, courage, and the ability to act when it mattered most. As the townspeople began to disperse, gathering their belongings and returning to the warmth of their homes, Jake remained at the center for a moment, letting the experience sink in. The frozen river, the flickering candles, the wind, and the snow had all been part of something larger, a story of bravery, leadership, and human connection that would remain with him forever. For the first time in years, Jake felt a deep sense of belonging. He had faced fear, embraced the unexpected, and acted with courage. He had broken the rigid structure of the ritual, yet in doing so, he had strengthened its meaning, showing that leadership was not just about endurance, but about initiative, empathy, and integrity. As the stars began to appear in the clear winter sky, Jake looked out over the frozen river, the snow glistening like diamonds in the moonlight. He knew that the memory of this night would stay with him forever, not just as a story of courage in the cold, but as a lesson in responsibility, leadership, and the power of human action. He turned to Silas, who gave him a nod of quiet approval, and finally, Jake felt ready to return to his cabin. The ritual had ended, but its lessons would guide him for the rest of his life. He had faced the cold, the fear, and the unexpected, and in doing so, had discovered something profound about himself. He was no longer just the quiet rancher who lived by routines. He was a man who had acted with courage, shaped a moment of tradition, and earned the trust of his community in a way that would be remembered for years to come. As Jake walked back across the snow toward the warmth of his home, he felt a new sense of strength. The wind still whispered across the hills, the snow still crunched beneath his boots, but he walked with confidence, knowing that he had faced the unknown and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. The wind had calmed by the time Jake made his way back across the frozen river toward his cabin. The stars twinkled in the clear winter sky, casting a pale silver glow over the snow-covered landscape. Every step he took left a deep impression in the fresh snow, each footprint a reminder of the path he had walked, both physically and metaphorically. He felt the lingering cold in his fingers and shoulders, but it no longer seemed unbearable. Instead, it carried a sharp, invigorating clarity, a reminder of the courage he had shown and the lessons he had learned that night. Jake paused for a moment, looking back at the river. The candles had long since been extinguished, but their glow lingered in his memory. He thought of the townspeople, each one carefully arranging their ritual items, chanting in unison, watching him with quiet expectation. He realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary, something that went beyond the physical discomfort of standing in the cold. The ritual was more than tradition. It was a symbol of community, trust, and courage. And now, having faced it, he understood its true power. As he approached the edge of the forest that bordered his ranch, Jake's mind wandered to the future. The winter cattle drive would begin soon, and he would lead his herd through snowdrifts and icy passes. He knew the challenges ahead would be difficult, but the experience of the ritual had prepared him in ways he had not anticipated. It had strengthened his resolve, sharpened his awareness, and reminded him of the importance of patience, respect, and leadership. The next morning, the town began to stir. Word of Jake's actions at the ritual had already begun to spread. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones, marveling at the courage and composure he had shown. Some of them approached him cautiously, offering quiet words of praise. "You handled yourself well, Jake," one said. "It takes a brave man to face that cold and still act with such care." Another nodded in agreement. "We've never seen anyone respond the way you did. You didn't just endure, you led." Jake nodded politely, accepting their words with quiet gratitude. He was not used to praise, nor did he seek it, but he understood the meaning behind their words. He had acted with integrity, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he had earned their respect. The sense of connection he felt with the town was new and profound, a reminder that courage was not only personal, it was shared, amplified through trust and community. In the days that followed, Jake's reputation as a leader grew. When the time came to begin the winter cattle drive, the townspeople trusted him implicitly. The herd moved steadily across the snow-covered hills, guided by his careful planning and steady hand. The lessons from the ritual lingered with him. He treated each decision with care, understanding that leadership was about responsibility, foresight, and respect for both the land and the animals. The ritual had taught him that courage was not always about dramatic gestures or daring feats. It was about consistent, thoughtful action, even in the face of fear or uncertainty. Jake's experience also changed the way he viewed tradition and community. In the past, he had been skeptical of rituals, seeing them as unnecessary or outdated. But now, he understood that tradition carried meaning beyond the surface. It connected people, offered guidance, and provided a framework for shared values. By participating and by stepping up when the ritual faltered, he had contributed to something larger than himself. He had not only followed tradition, he had enhanced it, giving it new life through his actions. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself reflecting often on that cold winter evening. He remembered the shivering cold, the intense scrutiny, and the moment when he had taken the first step into the center of the circle. He remembered the gust of wind that scattered the ritual items, the responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders, and the exhilaration he had felt as he guided the townspeople to restore order. Those memories were no longer frightening, they were empowering. They reminded him of what he was capable of, and of the strength that comes from facing fear rather than avoiding it. The townspeople continued to speak of the night for years to come. Children grew up hearing the story of Jake Hollister, the quiet rancher who froze in the cold, but then broke the ritual with courage and wisdom. It became a tale of bravery, leadership, and human connection, a story that reminded everyone that fear could be met, discomfort could be endured, and that true strength often lies in acting thoughtfully in difficult moments. Jake himself never sought to embellish the story. He spoke of it quietly when asked, focusing not on the drama, but on the lessons he had learned. He told others that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. He spoke of humility, responsibility, and the importance of honoring both tradition and the people who uphold it. Through these reflections, he passed on wisdom that extended far beyond a single ritual, inspiring others to face their own challenges with similar determination and care. Over time, the ritual continued to be performed each winter, but it was different now. Jake's actions had changed it, making it more flexible, more alive, more reflective of the real human courage and leadership it was meant to honor. New generations of ranchers followed the example he had set, understanding that the ritual was not simply about endurance or compliance, but about stepping up, taking responsibility, and acting with integrity even when the path was uncertain. Even in solitude, back at his cabin on quiet winter nights, Jake thought of that night often. He would stare into the fire, watching the flames dance, and recall the way the cold had bitten at his shoulders, the way the wind had scattered the ritual items, and the quiet determination that had carried him through it all. He felt gratitude for the experience, for Silas's guidance, and for the townspeople who had trusted him. Most of all, he felt a deep understanding of what it meant to lead, to face fear, and to honor something larger than himself. As the years passed, Jake's story became legend in the region. Travelers passing through the town would hear whispers of the rancher who had faced the winter ritual with courage, reshaping it through his actions and leaving a lasting mark on the community. People admired him not for bravado, but for quiet strength, humility, and the ability to act decisively in moments of challenge. His story became a model for leadership and integrity, illustrating that true courage often comes in the form of small, deliberate actions that make a meaningful difference. Looking back on that night, Jake understood that the ritual had not tested only his bravery in the cold, it had tested his heart, his judgment, and his character. It had shown him the value of patience, observation, and thoughtful action. And it had connected him to the people around him, in a way that no solitary life on the ranch ever could. He had learned that courage was not something that existed in isolation. It was cultivated through community, through responsibility, and through choices made in moments that demanded more than comfort or convenience. As he grew older, Jake often reflected on the lessons of that night during long winters alone on the ranch. He knew that the story of the ritual, of the wind, and of the scattered items would live on far beyond him, teaching others the same truths he had learned. He felt proud, not in a boastful way, but quietly, knowing that he had acted with courage, shaped a moment of tradition, and strengthened a community's sense of connection and purpose. And so, the quiet rancher who had once lived by routines and isolation became a symbol of courage, integrity, and leadership. His actions during that winter ritual changed not only the ritual itself, but also the way people viewed him, and more importantly, how they viewed the power of human courage and responsibility. As snow continued to fall gently over the hills each winter, the story of Jake Hollister was remembered and retold, a story of fear faced, challenges overcome, and traditions honored in a way that left a lasting legacy for generations to come. The night of the ritual became more than just an event. It became a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, even when the wind and cold seem unbearable, courage, integrity, and action could create something extraordinary.